Good morning, one and all. I'm delighted to be with you for the second day of the Parimat Days. A day that once again is going to be great, with great panel discussions and exciting topics all day. There are quite a few of you here this morning. From what I've heard about yesterday's party, it was actually quite a party, and well, I'll give the floor immediately to Michel Braffman and his guests, who are going to talk about decarbonization. If you'd please come on stage.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Good morning, one and all. Bright and early after an evening that ended quite late for some of you. So congratulations to all those of you who were able to come immediately here. So since we are pressed for time, whatever happens, we will end slightly before 11. So Mr. Bussereau, dear Dominique, you have an extremely diverse background, politically speaking. You were an expert of transport aspects. You were a member of government. You were State Secretary for Transport. You were a member of parliament, also a local official in the west of France, in charge of a fact-finding mission on infrastructure financing and transport coverage over the territory, a mission that you were recently given. You are the chair of EDEN, an energy equilibrium think tank bringing together companies from the road, air, maritime and rail transport sector, and you're an honorary member of the Air and Space Academy and the Navy Academy. My first question is, what approach are you recommending for a balanced approach to the issues that these sectors are facing in terms of decarbonization, but also competitiveness? Good morning, everyone. I hope that the party yesterday at Interallié did not tire you over much, but we can see that transport, with the recent discussion of the framework law in the National Assembly and soon at the Senate, and especially during a heat wave now, transport is an essential part of the economy for France's competitiveness. One of our main assets when foreigners look at France, what they highlight is the high-speed rail line, the harbor network, the motorway network, its quality. The German rail network is on the verge of crumbling down. Also good internet and wireless mobile connection, and that's essential for competitiveness. And then it's about our fellow citizens' daily lives, going to work, going on holidays, studying. And then there's another aspect, national development. We have a complicated territory with big mountain ranges, a kind of big central potato that is difficult to connect. And so there's an issue of equality at stake, and so I'm working with members of government on what they call national development high-speed rail lines. And so as soon as there's going to be competition for the SNCF from Trenitalia, Renfe and others, they're saying that the SNCF has begun thinking that it's going to lose money on its main high-speed lines, and so whereas it will have to focus on secondary lines, and so it will lose money and not be able to invest it. But of course, decarbonization is a central issue. France was one of the first countries in Europe to electrify its rail network. Major electrification waves in France, for instance, the Paris to Tours or Brive lines, happened before the Second World War. So that explains the issues that we are currently going through on the network. Sometimes there are overhead wire posts that are over 90 years old. So the rail network is partly electrified, and I'm sorry that electrification has almost stopped. The Germans are still electrifying regional networks, or they're adding electrical connection points on some lines to power battery trains. But in France, we have an electrification phase going on between Nogent-sur-Seine and Troyes, but that's about it. And then there's another connection connecting CDG airport to the north of France. So there's a French challenge for decarbonization in rail in France and Europe, and another decarbonization issue with marine transport. And there's another thing that Sandra is very familiar with, to decarbonize air transport, both on aircraft themselves, the way they are powered, their fuel, and also airports. So decarbonization is an issue that we can't solve on our own in France. If we do things on our own and our competitors in Europe don't do that, that won't work out. If we force airlines to use SAFs to go to Singapore, but when you stop over in Singapore, in Dubai to refuel, you don't need SAFs, so you won't use them. It is going to be less expensive. And there are also issues in terms of the International Maritime Organization, ICAO, for aviation, and issues of scale at the global level. Sandra, you have a background in the private sector centered on risk analysis within the Air France KLM group, first on geopolitical risk and then environmental risk. You joined the French Ministry of Transport and the French DGAC, the General Directorate for Civil Aviation, and you became Secretary General of the Observatoire de l'Aviation Durable, and we're both members of the Air and Space Academy in France. Why did you create an observatory for sustainable aviation? Well, Michel, thank you for this opportunity to share about this observatory. I'm deeply honored to be with you today and to talk about the history of this observatory that was created in a specific context. It was created in 2021 by Jean-Baptiste Djebari, who was then minister in charge of transport, and that was part of a threefold acceleration. Acceleration in regulation at the international level, at ICAO level. As soon as 2020, there were a number of communications, in particular the LTAG, which is the long-term aspirational goals. So all players in the aviation ecosystem and states agreed about the fact that in 2050 we had to be able to reach net zero. So no longer emit and offset residual emissions. So that ICAO reference was then taken up by different players, industrial companies, and also civil society operators. So there was international acceleration, but also at the European level, with the creation of the Green Deal, Refuel EU in particular, that defines and imposes the blending of sustainable aviation fuels, but that creates a legislative framework with publications as well. And at the French level, at the national level, at the same time, we had the Climate and Resilience Act and the French National Low Carbon Strategy, a whole legislative arsenal that was created. Things accelerated, and it's sometimes difficult to navigate that as citizens to understand how decarbonization fits in all that. And now also more and more publications. When we had the major forward-looking scenarios that were published by industry or NGOs, and also the sectoral roadmap was published, was worked on then in a an extended cooperative setting, and so that was coming from a regulatory obligation, Article 301 of the Climate and Resilience Act, that forced the sector to develop, to work on and publish a roadmap within a year as for other sectors. And there were also a number of societal expectations. We can see that, especially the younger generations have more and more questions, often legitimate ones, about our ability to decarbonize, and they are taking action to support their desire to travel also. Faced with this threefold acceleration, choices were made for the observatory, i.e. that the observatory is not standard setting, it's not a legislator or a regulator, it is within the French DGAC, but it's here to share knowledge and to give insights on an inclusive basis. So you are going to have a digital space, a website that is on the DGAC's webpage. Type Observatoire de l'Aviation Durable on your browser. We are well referenced, and you'll have 20 to 30 reference reports that are dated and sourced with pitches, so that you can navigate all this complexity, especially because all the various studies and scenarios, since they're produced by players that don't always have the same goals, sometimes you have different timelines, and that's a source of complexity. Some reports look out to 2030 or 40 or 50, but different timelines, but also different scopes. Some talk about only France and stop at the European borders. Some look at Europe, others at the whole world. Some look at regional aspects. And all this complexity is something that the observatory is trying to address by sharing data that are reliable, that are not opinions, but hard data, facts, and science. We went around research centers in order to support better understanding. Dominique, now we're talking more and more about reindustrialization in France and Europe to break with our current strategic dependency. How should transport be integrated into this momentum? Well, reindustrialization, of course, this is something that the French president cares very much about. He's been talking about that throughout his 10 years in office. Well, results may vary, but there are areas in France that have reindustrialized very well. The harbor areas. One of my former co-workers, who is the chairman of the executive board of the Marseille harbor, is saying with a big smile that he's more involved in industry than maritime. Of course, Marseille's traffic is not bad, but you can see the difficulty for Marseille's reindustrialization is connected with pollution and decarbonization, but you have to run a 400,000 volt high voltage line over the Camargue National Park, and that covers a very large part of that county's territory, and not many people are happy about that. There's reindustrialization in harbor areas, you can see that, but also with data centers. There's an entire debate, a rather stupid one, saying that data centers will use so much electricity that will run out. But on days like this one, we have to almost stop nuclear power stations, because solar is producing so much that if we don't want the grid to go down, as it did in Spain, and that almost happened twice in the spring in France, well, we've got too much solar. We don't, in high pressure times, that's not the moment when wind produces the most, but we need to find balances. And we could have data centers in every one of the 103 countries in France and overseas, and we would still have an excess of electricity to resell to our neighbor countries in Europe that want it. So there's potential for industry, but then, of course, industry needs to have flows. The number one transport flow in France is road transport. Of course, you can see that electric cars are surging, in terms of sales, especially with recent events in the Strait of Hormuz. EV purchases are growing in France, but that also applies to electric lorries, trucks. But if you're a CEO, if you want to buy an electric truck, it costs 3 times as much as a traditional lorry. So, of course, there are government subsidies and various schemes, but if you want to buy one at the same price as a traditional lorry, you'll need to buy Chinese. That's not necessarily a solution. And now there are so many batteries on board these Chinese lorries that they've got a lower payload than European e-lorries. And that's something that is going to stabilize. The think tank that I'm chairing after Brice-Lalonde recently conducted a survey over France and soon Europe about how to develop electric trucks. Well, I could imagine that we would have a lot of EVs in France in just a few years, but trucks will follow the same path with a few more years. But we need more charging stations. We're not talking about the stations that you use to recharge your electric R5. We'll need systems on the French motorway network and also the secondary road networks. So companies also, of course, need to have stations in their warehouses and depots. So that's a lot of investment that is underway, but that will take a fair few years, and it needs to be undertaken at the European level. In France, well, French hauliers account for less than 10% of international traffic and 43% of local traffic. So a majority of French of road haulage, long-distance haulage in France is done by French companies. It's mostly foreign companies that hire people from Turkmenistan or Afghanistan. So electrifying the road system to reindustrialize is necessary. We've talked about rail, and I can happily see that last year, in spite of a number of complicated reforms for the French rail operator SNCF at the European level, rail cargo traffic has gone on the rise again by 1.5%. River transport is very good. It can be fully electrified because given the distances and the fact that you have to follow certain rivers or canals, you can easily find ways to electrify, but you need to have the right ability to invest in our river and canal network. And then maybe we can talk later about shipping and aviation that goes through fuels for vessels and aircraft and electrifying harbors and airports. So yes, we are working on some of our weaknesses, the defense industry or some components to reindustrialize. That is doable, it's feasible. We've got assets, in particular our transport infrastructure, which is very dense, but that requires us to have a well-suited transport network that doesn't go against decarbonization goals. We can see that through these horrible heatwave days, electrification and decarbonization is an essential goal for the entire French industry. Sandra, decarbonizing civil aviation, is that on a credible pathway, or is it still too dependent on assumptions that are poorly controlled or not at all? Well, thank you very much for asking this question, Michel. I think that first we could explain a few challenges. Decarbonization cannot be imagined outside of global air traffic growth. So decarbonization will happen tomorrow, but we need to prepare for that today. Right now, with a number of solutions that I'll explain in a minute, we are able to support decarbonization effectively now. But with the increase in air traffic that we'll have in the next few years, that will require us to think out of the box. Air transport should double within the next 30 years. Well, I've got a question, Michel. Does anybody know the number of air passengers worldwide now? We gave the answer yesterday night. Okay, we're talking about 5 billion passengers, and we'll have 10 billion in 2045. So now we can see what is at stake for us. This first item needs to be included in our thinking and our decarbonization strategy. And secondly, this growth will not come from Europe. Not from Europe because the European market has been relatively flat. And it's mostly coming from Asia, from India and China, where millions of Indians are graduating to the middle class, and they have started last few decades to systematically use, well, for the first time, also repeatedly use aviation, and that's growth that is driven by Asia Pacific. Most of global air traffic growth will come from Asia. India will be one of the biggest markets for the global aerospace market, and most travelers who will travel in the next 20 years will be Asian. That's an important thing to take into account because that lets you gauge the size of the challenge. It's not coming from Europe. So the industrialization that we'll need to support these needs will have to include decarbonization challenges very early on. We have a number of assets. First, well, this goal is credible. There are already solutions. Some of them are mature. In particular, well, we also have a culture. Well, when you look at history, the aeronautics industry, aviation has made considerable gains. Since the 60s, energy efficiency of commercial aircraft has improved by over 80%. That's absolutely striking. This is an industry that innovates, and historically it has always been a driver of progress. So now we're mostly talking about efficiency gains, but it's also extremely innovative, especially in Europe with big industrial players. And that is good for our sovereignty. The solutions, I'll mention them quickly, they exist. We've talked about continuous improvement in energy efficiency with engines. We've got big engine manufacturers in France. There's also the renewal of fleets. That's very interesting because you can decarbonize at the beginning and at the end. So we have a truly international overview. That's the DNA of aviation. It's truly international and global, with one caveat, because once an airline has invested to renew its fleet, it will keep its aircraft for 10 to 12 to 20 years, depending on the airlines. So there are long lead cycles that we need to take into account. And of course, Dominique has talked about that. There's the rise of sustainable aviation fuels. I'll talk about that later, but that's a major technical driver, and they're operational already now. Operations are also becoming optimized in flights and on the ground. And also, of course, changes in regulations to support decarbonization at the international level. I was talking about decarbonization goals, but also at the European level with more stringent regulations, and in France with a number of laws and regulatory frameworks. And there's also investment that is made. Airlines are investing in renewing their fleets. Industries investing in innovation. You can see that there are regulatory frameworks that are maturing. So, of course, now there's a collective endeavor. So, yes, it is credible. However, there are question marks. These question marks, I would say, these uncertainties are found in the availability of energy to decarbonize and in the ability of industry to produce at large scale. And I would add, in France and Europe, there are sovereignty issues at stake here. The speed of our ramp up, our ability to organize a supply chain for SAFs, an alignment of regulations. We are talking about regionalization in the growth of air transport? Will we be able to align regulations? That's a question mark. And also we need to mobilize capital, because in particular a number of solutions like sustainable aviation fuels have a complicated economic equation, and it will be absolutely essential to solve it if we want them to reach maturity. And another challenge, well, the challenge is more about execution and economics, with a collective vision that we need, because indeed we're talking about a global industry. Another question to you, Sandra, but a very broad one, and please be as concise in your answer as possible. How to reconcile the various levers for aviation decarbonization, especially SAFs, energy efficiency, optimization of operations, fleet renewals, the use of hydrogen and e-fuels, intermodality and all that. All those drivers are they just caught up in an unrealistic and scattered strategy? Well, you need to remember that there are two dimensions. There are market segments. There's short haul, medium haul, and long haul. And the solutions are not the same, technically speaking, but also in their timelines. That's the first thing you need to keep in mind, because that's the lens through which we'll need to assess decarbonization. So the first question is really, what is the relevant driver for what segment at what horizon? So what is available right now? We've talked about operations. We tend to forget them, but that's important. Operations in flight or on the ground. For operations already now, we can reduce CO2 emissions. So fuel consumption, because there's a direct correlation already now. Pilots have been doing that on a daily basis with taxiing, and also air routes that are optimized by air traffic control. So already now we have a number of actions that are possible. It's also possible on the ground. You might have seen that when you fly. Very often there are electric connections. All the equipment that used to run on diesel has been electrified. So passenger buses, the loader that will put luggage in the hold, and the pushers that push the planes are electrifying. We're talking about small volumes, yet that is a concrete action already now, and France is quite ahead of the game on all that. Of course, the biggest lever is fleet renewal, as we mentioned earlier. We know that with the Airbus A320neo, you save 20% on CO2 emissions, and that's a considerable step forward. The A350 and the Boeing 787 have a 20 to 25% consumption gain depending on flight conditions. So fleets are newer, there are new generation engines. In France, we can be proud to have engine manufacturers. There were only 2 countries in the world, the US, France, and maybe China now, that can build an aircraft from end to end. And that's a strong pointer for our industry and our sector, and we need to be proud of that and defend it. Third message, of course, SAFs, very quickly, sustainable aviation fuels.
That's probably the key leverage and driver we can activate the quickest. There's so much at stake economically. We know how to produce SAFs, but it is costly for air companies. You're looking at 2 to 5 or 6 times the cost of traditional fuel, bearing in mind that fuel represents 25% of the costs for air companies. So economically, there's a lot at stake, and margins of air companies are only minor, so there's not so much margin for maneuver. So we have the available volumes. Challenge for today would be, first of all, access to raw material. Where do we go? To China? Would that be sustainable? The US? Again, would that be sustainable? Do we opt for an 80% decarbonization, or do we think about alternative solutions? All of these issues will probably be discussed on a European level shortly, since there will be shortly a review cycle of the regulatory framework coming up in 2027. So there you have it. There are solutions that we can offer from now on, and others will be available over time. Now, with regards to medium-haul flights, we'll be looking at hybrid solutions. So for 19-seaters, you can opt for a hybrid aircraft. And then for the long-haul flights, you can opt for SAF. Because that would involve much more considerable volumes. So these are the solutions that are on the table right now, and all of the topics we're currently addressing with different timelines. Dominic, in a context of growing concerns related to climate change, the transportation sector is very often pointed out and even boycotted, as is the case in the aviation industry. Is that a concern for the future of these sectors? Certainly not. Sandra explained to us the way in which, in terms of fuel management, aviation management, we could shift the lines. And when you take a look at the figures in France, transport by air, which was a mode of transportation that was dedicated to the wealthiest in the 1970s and 80s, and now, well, it's actually younger people, not boomers. And business aviation, so for corporations, is on the rise, although one must admit that in France we haven't quite picked up with the levels of pre-COVID, which is an issue. Goes to show that we have a problem in terms of our competitiveness. And the government and the parliament, unfortunately, are not doing anything to make things for the better. For example, with the many taxes that are currently being implemented. So there's a bit of a counter signal here that's being sent out by public authorities, unfortunately. But I've no worries about the aviation industry. That young Swedish girl who was going around Europe by train is now flying everywhere. But of course, she's not speaking about this. And then there are other countries such as India, where there's been a significant increase in air traffic with the construction of new airports. Africa is an air desert right now. If you want to go from Abidjan to Dakar, you pretty much have to fly through Paris or Addis Ababa or Istanbul. So air transport is bound to develop and modernize. A few years ago, when I was the Minister for Transportation, people were scandalized because there were old Boeing 747s flying to the Caribbean, but now they're no longer complaining about this because obviously there are now other solutions on the market. So I'm not worried about the future developments. The air transportation will develop, will grow, and France needs to play a role here. And the EU should be here to support, as we do, instead of just adopting constraining policies. Now, what about the other modes of transportation? Railway, that's a win. There has never been so many people in trains, traveling on regional trains, national trains. So Louis Hermont, for example, one of the major figures in the railway industry in France and in Europe, he used to say that if railway survives the 21st century, it will be the mode of transportation of the future for the 21st century. And that is the case. Even in the US, they're starting to build high-speed lines between two Californian cities. And that story will go on and expand in China as well. The high-speed network, the Japanese in 1964 built the first high-speed line, so 230 kilometers back then. Today, the most recent French high-speed trains go at a pace of 320 kilometers per hour. So first network for high-speed trains is China. Second is Spain, actually, not France, surprisingly. They benefited from European credits to build a high-speed network that's now longer than ours. And then the third is naturally France. So railway freight, transportation of people by train, absolutely no worries. This industry will be booming in the future and is great also for decarbonization. What about maritime? Transport by sea. Well, with the crisis we just experienced, which is still ongoing, we can see that maritime transportation is really booming. And so when the maritime transportation world is disrupted, the entire world is disrupted in terms of oil supplies, for example, for India, for China, for Russia. We can see that when there's any slowdown on the maritime transportation side, the entire economy of the world slows down. In France, both the Banque de France and government have unfortunately reduced our growth prospects for 2026, and the same applies to other countries, notwithstanding the inflation that is growing in the US, and which will probably play an important political role during the midterms in October. So here again, our economy will be more and more maritime in the world. Recently, I visited the various construction sites across the Atlantic. We will not be able to all go on board of this famous Corinthian ship, because that would be too costly. It's a full luxury cruise ship with a very brand new wind powered system. And I think that wind power actually will be on the rise in the future for shipping. Transport by road, we've spoken about this. And then you have quite naturally decarbonized modes of transportation, such as the bicycle and walking, although this year, due to the heat wave, we haven't been so prone on these. So I would say that there is no way back now. Quite on the contrary, we'll be more and more on the move in France and Europe, in the entire world. There are many people that do not have the financial or social or technical resources that cannot really make a move right now, but they will make a move in the future, just like Beijing, for example. In 1976, China was still building steam engines for its rail transportation. Today, when there's any Chinese holiday, the entire population travels by plane. And if there's one sector that consumes CO2 but is also saving lots, that would be the sector of transportation. This is the sector where there is the most innovation and where there will be the most innovation. But quite simply, we need to put an end to that myth of hydrogen. This is a myth that has existed in the maritime and air industry as well, and in Europe, actually, because the Chinese think that they'll be the world's top champion for hydrogen and the entire world will run on hydrogen. I'm not exactly sure that they're right in thinking that, but in France we had started to order hydrogen powertrains. Now we're going back on that. Same for Germany. both for maritime, air, and sea transportation. I don't think we're not quite there yet for hydrogen, but let us be quite cautious here because the Chinese think the exact contrary. Okay, so sustainable fuels. Are they a key leverage for the decarbonization of air transportation? Well, SAF is the main leverage for decarbonization in the future for transportation by air, but it's also in terms of execution, the key challenge. Now, 4 key points that I want you to keep in mind. And air transportation today accounts for 2% of emissions of CO2 in the world. That might seem not so much, particularly compared with cars, for example, or other industrial activities. However, still in this line of growth, still with that rationale of growth, we have a responsibility to integrate decarbonization solutions for the future. So SAF is one of them. So sustainable aviation fuel, that's what SAF stands for, and that's a must. Why? Well, first of all, because there is no credible battery-powered solution that exists to this day. Hydrogen involves many constraints in terms of volumes and infrastructure for the aeronautics sector. And then there's an entire world fleet which needs to be decarbonized. So here SAF could be the correct answer to the need. SAF is easy in the sense that it is compatible with all engines, all planes, and all operations. No need to change anything anywhere in terms of your infrastructure in the airport, in terms of your planes, operations, engines. And since this is in an indifferentiated distribution that's operated in airports to fuel planes, you never really know actually whether you were fueled with SAF or not. And that's really important because operations is a key aspect in that story. So this is a solution that's available, compatible with the current operating model. And in the IATA scenarios, or ATAC scenarios, so associations of air transport operators, SAF account for 60 to 65% of the solution by 2050. So we really need to go there, and massively so. Now, I'm going to be careful because I'm so excited about this topic that I could go on and on about this for hours. Anyway, SAF represent technologies and biomasses which correspond to different stakes in terms of financing, industrial maturity, etc. So there are various families of SAF that exist, starting with the most well-known, the hydroprocessing of used oil. So basically a circular model, which is great to reduce CO2 emissions at the source by 70, 80, or even 90% sometimes. So it works, it's available. The only problem with this is, first of all, the availability of resources. Where are these resources? Are they in Europe, in China? And can they be attributed to biodiesel, to the automobile sector, to the aviation sector? And then there's an economic challenge. How sustainable is that? From an economic standpoint, for the moment, that is a key problem for that industry to truly boom. And then you have alcohol-based SAF with ethanol or bioethanol. And here the main issue is economic competitiveness and capex. The economic equation for the first kind of SAF is resource-based. But with biodiesel, for example, you only need a segregated tank and that's it. But for the other technologies, you need to build production units. So here, capex enters the story. The Ministry of Transportation has launched a number of calls for projects which are financed for these industries to emerge. You can also use farming residues and forest waste. That's the so-called Fischer-Tropsch technologies, whereby you're going to use gas to obtain fuel. And then there's a third kind of SAF.
Merci. Comme vous voyez, je suis absolument passionnée par le sujet et je...
So as you can see, I'm quite passionate about the topic. I could talk about this endlessly. Anyway, so main challenges: scaling up, i.e. industrialization and financing of production capacities, and also the economics for new business opportunities and pricing, and sovereignty. Sandra, please have a glass of water. Maybe we can take a few questions from the audience, actually, but we weren't quite finished, actually. So Sandra, perhaps we can give you a break for you to recover, and I'll ask Dominique a question in the meantime. In your opinion, what are the next best steps to improve the competitiveness of the air transportation industry? Well, the next steps, we just spoke about this. France, Europe, the world needs to decarbonize the air transportation industry. Recently, I went to Airbus. They have a major research center working on new wings, which will be tested shortly somewhere in the southwest of France. So there are wonderful technological innovations on the way. Also with electric planes in the Maritime, for example, we have 2 plants working on small planes for the moment. For aero clubs, but most certainly in the future we'll be able to build short and medium distance passenger planes in the future. So I'm not worried for the aviation industry. Now, what about railway? Railway is significantly evolving. We'll be increasing the speed of high-speed lines in a number of countries, starting with Spain. We're also producing lighter trains with more seats on board. There will be a new high-speed trains which will be launched in the second quarter, and they're much lighter than your traditional trains. They consume less. They can transport more passengers, so many technological advances, and the best is yet to come. And what about urban transportation? Now, that's something we haven't spoken about yet, and yet it is evolving so much. In 1974, there were just 3 tramway lines left in France, in Marseille, Saint-Étienne, and Lille. Today, we have 30 plus cities in France that have modern tramways. And France really is leading these new developments, and the same applies to automatic trains. In the press, there hasn't been so much about that, but in less than 7 years, there will be 200 kilometers of automatic metros in Paris and around Paris, with 65 metro stations, which will be quite some architectural feat. The French do not really know about that, and it will be delayed, as often is the case with these kinds of projects. But from a technological and a speed and comfort standpoint for passengers, this will be a major development and milestone. So these developments are underway. Same applies to ships, lorries. So absolutely no worries to be had. If there's one domain in which France, and I'll end on this a positive note. I'm for an appointment with the president of EDF to speak about electrification very shortly, so I'm going to have to leave. But if there's one domain in which France is leading, that would be it. With Alstom, with Airbus, one of the largest plane manufacturers in the world, we have groups that do transportation around the world with RATP Dev and Aeolis or Transdev. They build metros, buses, trains in the entire world, in China, India, in the Emirates. We have Safran, Thales, for ticketing, etc. Now, reactors, we do not do them for the aviation industry. We rather use American or British ones, but that's about it, really. For ships, though, we only do cruise ships, small transportation ships, small fishing boats, but we do not build any large ships. In fact, no one really does, and that's why it will be particularly hard for the US to rebuild their military fleet from scratch, because only the Indians, Chinese, and Koreans now master the technologies that are needed for container ships and all these kinds of large ships. So I'm quite optimistic with regards to decarbonization and the electrification of transportation, and with regards to France's role as a leader in the future. Okay, so thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're not going to have any time for the Q&A, so thank you actually to the president of EDF for allowing us to keep us with the schedule. Well, perhaps you would like to say a few words to conclude, Sandra, now that you have recovered your voice. Well, on hydrogen, actually, I wanted to say a few words. Interestingly, there's a solution that we've spoken about for planes, for ships. Hydrogen allows for storage. And requires storage at minus 150 degrees Celsius. So the whole issue is about the transformation of the plane. And Airbus is currently working on this. That's an important point. It's not going to happen anytime now, but by 2040 or 2050 it is possible. But actually we can use hydrogen today in SAF to make e-fuel, and that's really important. Really bear in mind that we have hydrogen solutions in France. Obviously, that involves a lot of decarbonized solutions. Well, the distinguished minister said that he was optimistic. Do you feel optimistic about decarbonization? Yes, I am. And so I am. And also to our audience, I wanted to say that in the world of transportation, it's not just about techniques or technologies, it's also about your role as insurers. That's really important to make sure that that entire ecosystem is stable. And as per the Strait of Hormuz crisis has shown us, there's a huge insurance equation to be solved. For any system, collective system such as that of transportation to work well, we need a solid insurance system, and I fully count on you to make it happen. Okay, thank you very much to the three of you. Message heard.